The 6 Swans. A king went hunting in a vast forest, got lost, and couldn't find his way out. Finally, he came upon a witch and asked her to show him the way out of the forest. However, the witch told him she wouldn't do it. He had to remain there and would lose his life. He could only be saved if he agreed to marry her daughter. The king cherished his life, and he was so frightened he said yes. So the witch brought the maiden to him. Though she was young and beautiful, he couldn't look at her without getting the creeps and secretly shuddering. However, he intended to keep his promise. Then, the old woman led both of them on the right path out of the forest, and once they were at the king's home, the witch's daughter became the king's wife. The king still had 7 children from his first wife, 6 boys and a girl, and since he was afraid the stepmother might harm them, he brought them to a castle in the middle of a forest. It lay so well concealed that nobody knew the way to it, and he himself would not have found it if a wise woman had not given him a ball of yarn. When he threw the ball before him, the yarn unwound itself and showed him the way to the castle. Since the king loved his children very much, he frequently went to the castle. However, the queen became curious and wanted to know why he was going out into the forest all alone. She interrogated the servants, and they revealed the entire secret. The first thing she did was to use her cunning and acquire the ball of yarn. Then she took 7 small shirts and went out into the forest. The ball of yarn showed her the way, and when the 6 little princes saw her coming from the distance, they were delighted because they thought their father was coming and ran out to her. But all at once she threw a shirt over each one of them, and as soon as they were touched by the shirts, they were turned into swans and flew away over the forest. The queen thought that she had gotten rid of all of her stepchildren and returned home. So the maiden, who had remained in her room, was saved. The next day the king went to the castle in the forest, and the maiden told him what had happened to her brothers, and showed him the swan feathers that had fallen down into the courtyard. The king was horrified, but couldn't believe that the queen had done such an evil deed. At the same time, he was worried that the princess might also be stolen away from him, so he wanted to take her with him. However, she was afraid of her stepmother and begged the king to allow her to spend 1 more night in the castle. Then, during the night, she fled and went deeper into the forest. She walked the entire day, and toward evening she came to a hut. Once she entered, she found a room with 6 small beds. Since she was now tired, she lay herself down beneath one of the beds and wanted to spend the night there. Yet, at sunset, 6 swans came flying through the window, landed on the floor, and blew on one another until all their feathers were blown off as if some cloth had slipped off them. And there stood her 6 brothers. She crawled out from beneath the bed, and the brothers were both glad and distressed to see her. "You can't stay here," they said. "This is a robber's den. When they come home from their marauding, they live here. We can take off our swan skins for only a quarter of an hour every evening and assume our human form during this time. Then it's all over. If you want to rescue us, you must sew 6 little shirts made out of asters. But during this time, you're not allowed to speak or laugh. Otherwise, all your work will be for naught." As the brothers were speaking, the 1/4 hour expired, and once again they were transformed into swans. The next morning, however, the maiden gathered asters, perched herself on a branch of a tall tree, and began to sew. She didn't speak a single word or laugh. She just sat there and concentrated on her work. After she had been there for some time, the king who owned this land went hunting and came to the tree where the maiden was perched. His hunters called to her and told her to come down. But because she was not permitted to answer them, she wanted to satisfy them by throwing them presents. So she threw them her golden necklace. Yet they continued to call out. So she threw them her girdle, and when this didn't work either, she threw down her garters, and little by little everything that she had on and could do without, until she had nothing left but her little shift. Still, this was not enough for the hunters. They climbed the tree, carried her down, and led her by force to the king, who was astonished by her beauty. He covered her with his cloak, lifted her onto his horse, and brought her to his home. Even though she was mute, he loved her with all his heart, and she became his wife. Now, the king's mother was angry about all of this, and spoke ill of the young queen. Nobody knew where the wench came from, and she wasn't worthy of the king. When the queen gave birth to her first child, the old mother-in-law took the child away and smeared the queen's mouth with blood while she was asleep. Then she accused the young queen of having eaten her own child and of being a sorceress. However, because of his great love for his wife, the king refused to believe this. Sometime later, the queen gave birth to a second prince, and the mother-in-law played the same trick and accused the queen of cannibalism again. Since the queen wasn't allowed to talk and had to sit there mute and work on the 6 little shirts, she couldn't save herself and was sentenced to burn at the stake. The day came when the sentence was to be carried out. It was exactly the last day of the 6 years, and she had managed to finish sewing the 6 shirts. Only the left sleeve of the last shirt was missing. When she was led to the stake, she took the 6 shirts with her, and when she stood on the pile of wood and the fire was about to be lit, she saw the 6 swans flying through the air until they descended right near her. So she threw the shirts over them, and as soon as the shirts touched them, the swan skins fell off, and her 6 brothers stood before her in the flesh. Only the 6th one was missing his left arm. Instead, he had the swan's wing on his shoulder. Now she could speak once again, and told everyone how her mother-in-law had slandered her in such a wicked way. Consequently, the old woman was tied to the stake and burned to death instead of the queen. Now saved, the young queen lived with the king and her 6 brothers a long time in great joy. The end.